Anna Lappé with Edible Education 101, here with Mark Bittman, who needs no introduction. And Mark, I would love to start with how you got started. So what got you interested in food? Was there an aha moment where you realized this is what you wanted to spend your life working on as a cookbook author and as a columnist?
I still haven't had that moment, actually. But I started cooking out of self-defense because I went to school in Massachusetts and the food was so terrible that I just couldn't bear it. So I met some people who cooked and I started cooking. And then, say 10 years later, when it was time to earn a living, when I wanted to figure out what it was I was doing, I had always wanted to write. And by that time, I'd been cooking for almost 10 years. And the natural thing for me to write about seemed to be food. When I tried to write about other things, no one was interested. Mm-hmm. And when I started writing about food, people were. So then one thing led to another. I mean, that was over 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And did you start out kind of seamlessly moving from the culinary arts of cooking to the politics of food, or did that come much later? Kind of what was that transition? Because, some people, they hear your name and they think, oh, that's the guy who taught me everything I need to know about making the perfect frittata. And then other people hear your name and they think, oh, that's the guy who's, taught me what I need to know about food politics. And for some, that might seem kind of like a split personality. So just curious about, that connection between like the politics of food and the practice.
It's nice, isn't it? It worked out quite happily. I was political before I started cooking. I was doing community organizing, or, I was a student, radical, anti-war demonstrator, commie pinko, long hair in the late 60s. And then I started cooking, and then I was working as a community organizer. So I was cooking and running a newspaper, a community newspaper, and driving a taxi, actually. That was my early 20s. So I think there wasn't a lot of talk about food then, but there was talk of the environment. And I like to think that I and other people saw that there was a interconnectedness among issues, as there is now. There were welfare struggles, there were rent control struggles, there were anti-racism struggles, integration struggles, women's struggles, gay people were starting to become active, the environment was a big issue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And some of us thought, well, these are part of a system. It's the system that's causing all of these problems. It's the system that has to address them. When I started to write about food, I was at a real disadvantage because no one was interested in food and politics, nor was there really much thought about that, even on my part. I wasn't a chef. Most people at that point in the early 80s were interested in chef recipes. I wasn't even trained. I was just some writer guy who knew how to cook. That worked out. That's obviously a long story, but 20, 25 years later, or even say, 15, 20 years later, Eric Schlosser wrote Fast Food Nation, Morgan Spurlock came out with Supersize Me, Michael wrote a number of books, including Omnivore's Dilemma. It became clear to me in some ways that I'd missed the boat, and in other ways that I was nicely primed to do something that I'd long thought was worth doing, which was move from only cooking to talking about food.
So you just talked about how much you saw food as part of a system and part of sort of symptomatic of how many systemic things needed to change. And I'm curious, I kind of have a theory that over the past decade or 15 years or so, that a lot of people have come along with you, have come along to this point where now they think about food in terms of a system, that more everyday Americans, when they walk into the grocery store, they don't just look at aisle 8 and pick whatever's on the shelf. They actually have that curiosity about the story of their food. I'm curious if you also kind of agree with that, if you really feel like there has been this attitudinal change. Of course, not every single person in the country, but if you really do feel like there has been a significant shift in people's ability to grasp that food is part of a system and that it's a system itself that needs to be addressed and fixed.
Definitely. I mean, everybody who's a marketer, everybody knows that this is a very big country. And if you have 1% of the population of the United States paying attention to you, that's a lot of people.
Right,
that's 3 million plus people. So if you think 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 1% of the population was paying attention to food, or even 1/10 of 1%, it's 10 times that now. Whatever it was then, it's 10 times that. So there are probably tens of millions of people now who are consciously thinking about food. Not just what can I eat, or do I want Indonesian or Italian, or how can I get 1,500 calories in one meal, but where's this food coming from, what's in it, what's it about, etc. I think the lucky thing about my column, someone said to me this week, you took what were fringe issues and made them mainstream. I don't think that's true at all, but my column happened during a time when what were fringe issues became mainstream. I was lucky enough to be able to represent some of that, which is great. But, think about, people didn't even know how to pronounce the word vegan 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And now veganism isn't a scary thing. I mean, we may or may not agree with it, but vegans exist. So,
right.
Change happens.
Yeah, and I mean, I think with your column too, I think it is fair to say that a lot of the issues that you raised in that column did help bring topics that were marginal or they're in the shadows to the light. I mean, I think that's what good journalism does, right? It shines a light in the places that are dark. It shines a light on places that those in power don't want there to be light on them. And I think that your column really did that really powerfully. I'm curious, you're talking about this real consciousness shift and how many more people are asking questions about what's wrong with food and how to fix it. I'm curious what you see as the 3 or 4 most pressing issues, right? There's the system itself, we can agree, is broken in so many ways. I know some people feel a bit paralyzed by that, by feeling that there's so much to fix, there's so much that's not working, there's so much harm that's being caused by the food system. But if you could kind of tease out what you see as the most pressing problems and where you actually feel like there's some momentum, where you really feel like change is possible.
Well, I think that's the big question, and that's my focus for the last couple of years, is identifying the most important issues that are also the most attackable issues. So I think chief among them, I think we've seen the most success in labor issues. That's because to some extent that's not only a food issue, obviously, although as we know, 8 of the 10 worst paying jobs in the United States are in the food system. Food workers are notoriously underpaid and so on and so forth. But the fight for 15 has been led to a large extent by food workers. It's been more successful than many of our other struggles. It's critically important. And 5 years ago, no one was talking about it. Mm-hmm. So there's
and 5 years ago, people would have said, oh, $15 an hour minimum wage, impossible.
Right.
Yeah.
Try for 10.
Right.
Why don't you try for 10? Maybe you'll get it. And when I started writing that column, and I was saying things like, the so-called food movement cares more about animals than it does people, that wasn't tongue-in-cheek. You couldn't get so-called foodies to talk about labor issues. Well, now you can. So that's one. 2, I've said this before, I've said it to you, to me the most heartbreaking issue is the issue of marketing junk to children. I don't see the kind of progress I'd like to see on that, but the Berkeley soda tax is a good start. There are some other positive signs. I think we're going to see soda taxes in 15 cities in the next few years. I think we're going to see action on limiting marketing of junk to children, but it's not going to happen nationally. It's going to happen locally, unless it could get better.
And what do you say to the people who hear you say that and say, oh, Mark Bittman, you are the ultimate food nanny or food police, and you're trying to dictate what I should eat? How do you respond to that charge?
You can call me whatever you want, I don't care. But the government mandates we wear seatbelts. The government determines what taxes are on cigarettes and alcohol. It's clear that sugar is bad for us. It's clear that marketers have the upper hand. They are selling more sugar every year. We need help. We need to be defended. And one of those defenses is a soda tax. And it's not only grown-ups. I mean, it's especially kids. So, the whole argument about how kids are not rational. I mean, I don't think grown-ups are rational either, but kids are less rational. We mandate that there are car seats. We want to protect our children. This is a way to protect them. So that's 2. 3 is antibiotics in the food supply, which I don't see as it's not an issue on the same level as the other 2. It's not I don't want to downplay it either, but it's not super, super important, but it's so easily fixed that I really would thought that the Obama administration would have just fixed it, because FDA has the power to say you will not use antibiotics routinely, prophylactically in the growing of animals, raising and growing of animals. There's two big effects that banning them would have. One is it would make it easier to raise animals in factory farms, whatever you want to call them, industrially. And the second is we'd have more effective antibiotics. And then the fourth, if there is one, is factory farms, which I'd like one of my personal projects is in the next 2, 3, 4 years to see one CAFO closed for one good reason. Find, again, the chink in the armor. Find a CAFO as consolidated animal feeding operations, what we might call factory farm, to find one that's doing something so egregious in a place where the rules are maybe a little stricter and there's a more sympathetic judge or whatever, however it's done, close one and the rest will follow, and that would be a big change. But that's a longer term project, I think.
Mm-hmm. At least I feel like there's some hope with examples, especially in the Midwest, of communities that have stopped CAFOs from starting. It's different from closing one down, but you are hearing about communities that are able to activate locally in Missouri and other places and to really block CAFOs from starting in the first place.
Which is really great. I mean, the unbelievable thing about CAFOs is that not only does EPA, which would be one of the regulating agencies, I imagine there are a number of agencies or jurisdictions that could slow down the growth of CAFOs or even start closing them, but not only does EPA not regulate or close CAFOs, it doesn't know how many CAFOs there are.
Right,
and it doesn't even know how many there are, where there are, anything. So there's something like 25,000 at this point.
So can you talk about how you explain how, to think about these issues you just mentioned, and antibiotics, for instance, as you said, it's fixable. We could stop the usage. Other countries have limited the usage of antibiotics in factory farms, and it's not like they've all gone hungry. Or the example of CAFOs, not really, even our own Environmental Protection Agency not having an accurate count on them. Can you talk about how you explain why there has not been more progress? You mentioned the Obama administration you would have thought would have done more on antibiotics, for instance. How do you explain why there hasn't been more progress on these winnable issues and that also are very popular issues? Why aren't we seeing more progress?
I think in a way it helps to go back to the Fight for 15 and say 2 years ago, or as you said, 5 years ago, if you said people's minimum wage should be $15. But it really wasn't 5, it was really 2 or 3. And people would say to you, try 10, or 15, you're crazy. But then people organized and people made a fuss. And we did not, it's on the Obama administration, but it's also on us. We did not push hard enough on removing antibiotics from the food supply. We haven't made enough noise about CAFOs. And again, the real tragedy is we have not made enough noise about stopping the rapacious marketing of junk to our children. This could not be worse, and we are not fighting it. And if we fight it, federal government is going to be forced to respond to that. At least now we're seeing response on a local level.
And why don't you feel like there has been more of that fiery outrage that sometimes it takes to see that change happen? Or do you feel like that's out there, it just hasn't been channeled toward the kind of policy change that you think we should see? We are getting away from food here, which is fine with me. But people are frustrated, people feel powerless. If you look at the success of the Tea Party movement is based largely on people feeling frustrated, feeling fed up with government not acting on their behalf, feeling like there's nothing that they can do to change it. And what we have here, what we see here, is a revolving door policy between the federal government and industry, where the federal government generally thinks that the business of America is business, and that promoting industrial success or promoting the success of corporations will be beneficial for everybody. That has been demonstrated not to be the case. A rising tide does not lift all. Well, a rising tide does lift all boats, but that metaphor doesn't work with the the national economy. And we are starting to see people in this election cycle, and we're talking now in spring of 2016. In this election cycle, we're seeing that frustration come out. We're seeing people saying, we don't like business as usual. We don't
support mainstream candidates. We want real change at this point. We saw that in 2008. I think many people thought of Obama as a change candidate, but in the long run, we have to support candidates who are in favor of change, and then we have to push them once they're in office. And this is the way things get done in this country. We can't vote for people who are beholden to corporate interests. We have to ask people who are running for office what you intend to do about food, as well as income inequality. And we're going to hold you to that. We want to see action.
Well, let's talk about the presidential campaign. As you mentioned, we're in the heart of it right now as we speak, and in the heart of the primaries. And yet, you listen to the presidential candidates right now who are running in the primaries, and I have barely heard the word food or farming or anything about food policy mentioned. You look at the debates, it rarely comes up as a topic. And I'm curious how you think we can change that, and if you think that that's a sign of a problem, the fact that food isn't seen as an issue that these candidates are kind of campaigning around.
It's a huge problem. And just this week, we saw Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders square off over soda taxes in Philadelphia, which was great, although Bernie was disappointing and disappointed me and probably many other fans in a big way for the first time.
Right, because he said that he called the soda tax regressive, and he said he was opposed to it compared to Hillary, who stood in support of the Philly soda tax.
Which, good for her. And maybe a turning point. But until that point, I think the only mention of food or agriculture by any candidate was Ted Cruz coming out against the ethanol mandate, which go figure. But I think part of it is that Iowa is the first primary, and that the Midwest is so dependent on industrial ag and factory farming, and that candidates don't want to alienate an entire third of the country by saying we really need to change the food system. Part of it is that it's an intricate subject, and they haven't really started to look at it. Again, that's on us for not pushing them on it. But the fact that Bernie Sanders can come out and show such ignorance of the whole food system, because to say the soda tax is regressive is to not understand anything. To me, it says he doesn't understand anything. And I've said that about him. The guy has not paid attention to food. He's not interested in it. We need to press these people. Part of the work that I do is with Union of Concerned Scientists, and we've got this campaign called Plate of the Union, which is designed to press candidates, not just presidential candidates, but senatorial candidates and congressional candidates, House of Representatives candidates, on food issues. And to say what I just said a minute ago, what are you going to do about these issues? We actually care. But we have to be willing to say we actually care.
Right. And what I appreciate about that Union of Concerned Scientists campaign, the Plate of the Union that you mentioned, is I feel like it has the long game in mind. I think that I really see it as building toward the next presidential election, this idea that it might take one more cycle or maybe two more, but that we will come to a place inevitably, I believe, that it will seem absurd that you could run a presidential campaign and not put food at the heart of your platform.
Yeah, well, good point.
So we'll have to see in a few years. We'll have to get back together and see if that prediction was right. So I want to end, Mark, with a question that I'm curious to hear you would answer. If you could cook dinner for anybody, who would it be, and what would you cook?
Well, I don't know what I would cook, but I would like to cook dinner for my mother's mother, my grandmother, who really, she really just showed me that it was all possible by example. And that is the way to teach people how to cook, is just you do it and your kids watch you do it. I want to say one other thing, which you just alluded to. This is a long game. And not to harp on only one subject, but if we don't fix the way we teach our kids about food and the way that we let others market food to our kids, every year that goes by, we are seeing another year's worth of kids corrupted effectively. And 20, 30, 40 years from now, maybe it may be sooner, it may be farther away, we are going to be just kicking ourselves that we didn't act on this stuff sooner. And the sooner we realize that, the better off we'll all be.
Great. I couldn't agree more with my thinking about my 2 kids and thinking about this next generation. I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Anna.
I'm Anna Lappé with Edible Education 101. I've been talking with Mark Bittman. Thank you.